Hello, welcome to our online discussion of euthanasia and disability for January 16th, 2015. Happy New Year. My name is Amy Hasbrook and I'm the director of Toujours Vivant-Not Dead Yet. We are a project of the Council of Canadians with Disabilities whose goal is to unify, inform, and give voice to the disability rights opposition to assisted suicide, euthanasia, and other practices that have a discriminatory impact on people with disabilities. There are several reasons for our position, but to give you sort of the four main reasons. First, it's unnecessary to make any laws to legalize assisted suicide or euthanasia because everyone already has the option to commit suicide, or if they're too ill to do so, they can refuse medical care and have palliative sedation on demand, or palliative care to ease the pain, or palliative sedation so that they aren't even aware of it. Second of all, the practice is discriminatory because while people without disabilities receive suicide prevention services if they express a wish to die, people with disabilities who express the same wish will be encouraged and assisted to kill themselves. And that is a double standard that is discriminatory, and we as disability rights activists oppose that double standard. Thirdly, those who support assisted suicide say that it's a choice, but we believe that the choice to die cannot be free as long as people with disabilities don't have the choice of where and how to live. And as our society is currently arranged, that is the case. People with disabilities don't have the options to live in their own homes with personal assistance services that they control, hire, and employ themselves. And where that's not an option, then the choice is not free to die because people don't have freedom to live. And finally, the safeguards that have been instituted in these laws do not prevent people with disabilities from being wrongly killed. And everyone says, well, there will be safeguards, but evidence from all of the jurisdictions where it's legal shows that the safeguards have been ineffective in preventing people with disabilities from being killed. The goal of our online discussion is to give people with disabilities the option to discuss among ourselves and also to gain tools to participate in the debate. Generally, people without disabilities are the ones talking to each other about this issue. And on the one hand, there are people who consider themselves progressive who say that it should be legal. And on the other hand, there are conservatives or religious people who say that it should not be legal. And those of us with disabilities come at it from a very different perspective. Most of us have a lot of experience with the medical industrial complex. We know how wrong things can go when you end up in the hospital. And our direct experience informs our point of view. That experience of being in the hospital, but also the experience of living with discrimination and the struggle it can be to obtain the services and supports we need. So those are we wanted to create a forum for people with disabilities to discuss these issues among ourselves. There are different ways to participate. You can use Google Hangouts on Air. If you do a Google search for that and go to the main page, you should be able to see our Hangout. You can also do a search on YouTube for disability and euthanasia, and you'll be able to find our broadcasts. You can also look at our former broadcasts that we've done since September of 2013, so that's actually almost a year and a half now. You can get those online at my YouTube channel. And as I said, just doing a search on euthanasia and disability should pull it down for you. excuse me, for more information on the subjects that we discuss, you can go to our Facebook page, which is at facebook.com/toujours vivant, not dead yet. You can go follow me on Twitter, which is at @TVNDY. You can visit our website at tvndy.ca, or you can email me at info@tv-ndy.ca. Okay, our topics for today are the Ontario College of Medicine's end-of-life policy. They're looking for comments. We have 3 news briefs. First is that Not Dead Yet in the United Kingdom is in the London streets again, protesting Falconer's bill. The second is the euthanasia of a prisoner in Belgium was canceled. And finally, a French bill would allow terminal palliative sedation. So moving right along, the Ontario College of Physicians end-of-life care policy was issued in December on their website. And you can find their web address on our Facebook page, but it's basically http://policy-consult.cpso.on.ca/?ID=4943. So that is their that's the web address, and that will be on our Facebook page, that address. You could go look up the policy. The document is not very complete. It seems to be more like an exercise in public relations. It's not directed at doctors or administrators to help them make decisions. If the college wants to publish a flyer for the public, that would be one thing, but they shouldn't call it a policy statement, because whatever this is, it's not a policy statement. It's not complete enough. It doesn't cover the ground. It's really not written in that way. From a disability perspective, the policy presents a lot of problems. First of all, like the majority of documents that discuss end of life, the policy doesn't really distinguish between people who are in the process of dying and those who have severe functional limitations. Sometimes it does, but really most of it is lumping everybody in together and lumping them into one direction, which is towards death. It's about ending life. It's about, it talks about at the end of life, but it really is about going in that direction. So that's obviously something that is dangerous for people who have severe disabilities who aren't at the end of their lives. The policy neither recognizes nor resolves the double bind in which doctors have to defend the interests of their patients on the one hand, but they're also pressured to keep costs down. The policy doesn't address that at all, but it becomes very clear that those are conflicting priorities, even if you read the policy. As superficial as the policy is, you can really see that problem. In our comments, TVNDY listed several principles that should be included in a real policy to guide doctors and administrators who were providing healthcare. And here's a list of some of the principles that we mentioned. There should be a bias toward preserving life that governs all decisions. End of life should not mean ending life. The word person should be used instead of patient, because patient often sort of makes people into objects of medical care, whereas a person is, you can't deny that a person is person. Let's see, discrimination is not acceptable, any form of discrimination, especially in life or death judgments. And I'll mention this later as well, but there is a lot of research that shows that doctors have a negative valuation of the quality of life of people with disabilities, yet they're the ones making decisions as to the viability of somebody's life, what treatment would be appropriate for that person, and ultimately whether the person should live or die, and whether enabling the person to live is a reasonable standard of care. And so if discrimination is entering into that decision, that, especially if it's disability discrimination, that is a danger to those of us with disabilities. To prevent requests to terminate treatment, each person must have access to services and supports to allow a true choice in where and how to live. So if people are making choices based on the idea that they're going to be in a hospital for the rest of their lives, or you know, they won't have any control in their lives, that's going to influence their sense of what the choice is. So the idea here is to give people a full range of choices. Do you want to live in your home? You know, how do we adapt your home to make it possible for you to live there? Are you going to be on a respirator? We can give you, you know, can you get a portable respirator so you can continue to live at home? What would it mean to have a tube feeding? And, you know, that's pretty possible. How do you adjust to tube? All those things, you know, all of those things should be dealt with when somebody is, to prevent people from getting to the point where they're asking to stop treatment. A request for euthanasia or assisted suicide, or to withhold or withdraw medical treatment, should trigger a suicide prevention intervention. Like, as I said before, when people with disabilities express a desire to die, they're not treated as in the same way that non-disabled people are when they express the same desire. And in all the policies I've ever seen that describe the issue of withdrawing medical treatment, people who make that request are not treated as if they're suicidal, and that's not right. So the person should be considered suicidal, and they should be given suicide prevention treatment. Every person who needs it should have access to services and devices to allow for effective communications. And one example of this is, as I put up on our Facebook page yesterday, there is a fellow who in South Africa who was in probably would be called he was locked-in syndrome, I guess. For 12 years, he could not communicate, but he was completely aware and alert during that whole time. But without the option to communicate, he could not make his needs known, and his family did not believe he was conscious. So that is why people need to be given the means to communicate, even if it appears they aren't able to. It's very common that people with speech disabilities or who seem to lack consciousness are not given the options to communicate, but that needs to be made available to them. And if people feel out of control, being able to communicate is one way to enable them to have more control in their lives. Another principle that should guide such policies is that every person will have access to the necessary services and adaptive equipment to allow for timely and effective medical care. One reason that people with disabilities have poor medical outcomes is because most doctors' offices are not accessible or equipped with, for example, exam tables that can be lowered so somebody can get onto them. And it's pretty amazing how often even a physiotherapist's office is inaccessible, whereas the people who need a physiotherapist are generally people with mobility limitations. It seems really silly to me, but that is the case. And that results in people with disabilities not getting timely medical care, not getting tests they need because the testing equipment like mammograms or X-ray equipment or whatever is not accessible. And it means people are not diagnosed, not treated, and causes poor medical outcomes. So this is a principle that should guide such policies, that people need to have access to equipment and services on a timely basis. And finally, the idea of self-regulation that's proposed in this policy is not sufficient to prevent conflicts of interest and to prevent failures of accountability. So I think that should be kind of obvious, but as we see in Belgium, Wim de Stelsman, who is the head of the Euthanasia Commission in Belgium, is also a person who administers euthanasia quite often, and he that creates a conflict of interest because even though he's supposed to be making judgments that are bias-free, he obviously is taking one side of the position. So, and makes money off of speaking about his performing euthanasia. So he leads seminars and whatnot. So that is an example of lack of accountability and conflict of interest. Okay. Many essential terms are not defined in the policy, such as end of life. Seems pretty central to a policy on end of life, but it's not defined. Clinical benefit is also not defined. And again, when we're talking about people with disabilities, when the doctor is making a judgment as to whether something is a clinical benefit, if the doctor doesn't believe that it's a benefit for the person to continue living, then he may say a treatment doesn't have clinical benefit. So without these terms being defined in a neutral fashion, they're being defined individually and based on the doctor's bias. So other terms include capacity and futile care, and there's a whole bunch of other terms that are not defined. The policy lacks an explanation of standards of quality of care. And again, this is sort of what I just said, that without neutral standards, doctors are making it up as they go along based on their biases. And the list of what is important to patients and their families is substituted as what are, the standard of care. That's what the policy talks about as opposed as a standard of care. I offered some examples of actual performance standards or things that doctors should be obliged to do, which would be more along the lines of a policy. One is provide or coordinate and oversee the provision of state-of-the-art medical care to ensure the maximum level of functioning and quality of life. Provide or coordinate and oversee the provision of state-of-the-art pain and symptom management to relieve physical and psychological symptoms. Advocate on the person's behalf to obtain necessary authorization for medical treatment. Provide clear, honest information to the person receiving treatment and or his family. Communicate on a timely and consistent basis in language and by whatever means to ensure understanding and participation. That's including using sign language and including using language or sign interpreters, technology, or facilitators. So like I said, with that fellow who had locked-in syndrome, using a more effective means of communication would have been appropriate for him, such as using functional magnetic resonance imaging to at least establish that there was mental stuff going on, and then devising a way for him to communicate more effectively. Inform the person, using those means of communicating, inform the person of her diagnosis, prognosis, the available treatments, their potential efficacy and drawbacks, and the consequences of any decision. So I talk about communication a little bit later, but all that's sort of within this principle of standard of care. This is the standard that should be met in providing care under this policy. Doctors should be honest and forthright and compassionate in all dealings with the individual, his or her family, and other providers. They should work with social service and rehabilitation professionals to ensure that each person obtains services and supports services to support the maximum level of independence and integration, along with mental health providers, social services, and chaplaincy, or religious people who provide spiritual guidance. Promote positive family participation in decision-making, achieving a sense of control and meaning, satisfying spiritual needs, completing important tasks, and preparing for the end of life or the next step, if it's a person with a disability, by resolving conflicts and relationships and preparing for death, if that's what's going to happen. Ensure that all medical services, equipment, and facilities are accessible and available to persons with disabilities in a timely fashion. We talked about that under principles. Ensure that the person is free from abuse, exploitation, and mistreatment. That's very important when we're talking about end-of-life decisions and anyone who in a vulnerable position, because abuse is rampant of elders and younger people with disabilities. Care for the whole person, treating her with respect at all times. Affirm the person's inherent dignity by empowering the person to have control of his or her circumstances. So those are some of the standard of care items that I thought of and I'm suggesting in my comments for their policy. The section on advanced care planning in their draft policy looks more like a death planning document. As such, the policy excludes important decisions such as arranging long-term care at home and how to obtain, use, and adapt to life-saving equipment and medical services. They don't talk about that at all. They talk about it in terms of, well, checking off a list, but not as a thing that might actually happen. They talk about it essentially as a thing you'll check off that you don't want, as opposed to a thing you might actually do or have or want. So the section on advanced care planning suggests that doctors should frequently encourage people to prepare advanced care planning documents. But what that means on the ground is that people with disabilities are often harassed to sign do not resuscitate orders, or that such orders are placed on people's medical charts without their knowledge or consent. I've seen studies back from the 80s that talk about that problem up through now, so 30 years worth of studies that mention that. This is a very chronic problem, especially for people with cognitive disabilities. The Canadian Association of Community Living is very vigorous in working against this practice, but it is still very common. And it's common because people without disabilities think that the value of life with a disability is less than that without a disability. Documents used for advanced care planning are usually biased against life-sustaining treatment. They describe feeding tubes and respirators in negative terms rather than as the life-saving aids they are. Like I said, often those documents are check marks, like you don't want this, you don't want that. It's phrased as, do you want X, Y, Z? No, yes. So the no is put first, and when they're described, I saw a video where a nurse is describing these sort of things, and she's putting it in negative terms, and her tone of voice is very negative. Oh, well, you do have the option of tube feeding, but, blah, blah, blah. And, of course, the person says no, as opposed to there's a video on my YouTube channel, which you should check out, of a couple of teenage guys who use feeding tubes, and it's great. They're really, they talk about how to use it and how it works, and it's a very affirming, life-affirming video. So I think if people saw that video, and when they think about using a feeding tube, they'd say, oh, well, that's not so bad. So there you go. The section on refusing medical treatment doesn't mention that such requests are suicidal gestures, as I mentioned before, and should be treated as such. I mentioned that before. We won't hammer that to death. The policy should require doctors to consult palliative care and pain management specialists. Most doctors receive only about 8 hours of training in pain management during their medical education. This is not enough to offer effective and state-of-the-art care. There are many kinds of therapies for managing pain, not just opiates, but different medications, obviously, but also different kinds of treatment, neurostimulators and all sorts of things that are being used now. And it's a field that is advancing quickly, and doctors really should, a doctor who has a very limited training on this is not going to be equipped to deal with severe pain, and doctors don't like dealing with pain because they often see it as a symptom and they don't want to treat it. So if you have pain that's due to a chronic condition, the doctor won't really know what to do with you, and they'll say they may not be interested in treating your pain, so they should consult a pain specialist. The paragraph that talks about aggressive pain management gives the impression that the practice and the use of opiates should be limited to the end of life, which is not the case. There is no reason that opiates are an effective pain management option. It should be considered on a case-by-case basis based on how the person tolerates it and what the person needs. It shouldn't be automatically refused. It shouldn't be that you can only use it if you're at the end of life. Obviously it's what the person needs or what the person can tolerate that should make the decision what works for the person. The policy does not explain how bias and prejudice regarding people with disabilities will be excluded from doctors' decisions about what is the standard of care. I mentioned this a little earlier, but it's worth repeating that when the standard of care is up to the doctor to decide what is a medical benefit, or clinically beneficial. When the doctor is making that decision based on his or her prejudgment about quality of life with a disability, quality of life using a feeding tube or a respirator, and when that is the standard of care, there needs to be a mechanism for removing the bias against disability and against using medical devices, and there is no such mechanism. So, regardless of the state of the law on euthanasia and assisted suicide, physicians should keep in mind that killing is not a medical treatment. Okay, so even if the law changes to allow assisted suicide or euthanasia, as it will in Quebec, unless something happens, so, physicians should keep in mind that killing is nevertheless not medical treatment. It is neither the duty nor the responsibility of medical staff to end the life of persons under their care, even if the person requests it. The medical profession is charged to value, preserve, and improve the quality of life until the moment of natural death. This includes implementing the public policy of suicide prevention, not providing suicide assistance. A person who wishes to end his or her life may refuse medical treatment if he or she is too ill to take her own life, or otherwise, the person can commit suicide unaided. That is the state of the law now. It is what is available, and we do not need to change the law for people to have that choice. So, these are just a few of the many, many comments I wrote on this, on these on these proposed policies, and the comments are due on February 20th. So if you want to go and look at the policies and make a comment, you can get the link from our Facebook page and go from there. Okay, news briefs. Activists with NDY UK were in the streets of London again today to protest the Falconer Bill, which is being heard in the House of Lords. And they've been trying to kind of make little adjustments to make it more palatable. They've added a provision that a person would have to go to a court and get court permission for assisted suicide. And that is a good thing, but we still don't want assisted suicide for all of the reasons that we've talked about before. And adding the court, adding the necessity for court of going to a court does not change any of those reasons that it's not a good idea. So that's, we can appreciate that that is adding a safeguard, but we also understand that safeguards have not succeeded in protecting people. 350 people participated in a thunderclap, which generated 200,000 tweeted messages opposing the Falconer Bill. In addition, activists created posters with photos and messages so other people who couldn't be there physically could attend virtually. So there were, you can see photos on the NDY UK has a Facebook page, and you can see photos there of all the people who were there and the placards, lots and lots of placards. So that's worth looking at. Okay, another news brief is that a man serving a life sentence in Belgium won't get euthanasia. Frank van den Bleeken, who is serving a life sentence, had been granted permission by the Euthanasia Commission to be euthanized. That happened in the fall. That was, he got the permission in the fall, and he was supposed to have the euthanasia on January 11th. However, at the last minute, Belgium's justice minister intervened and canceled the procedure, but no reason was given for the change. So that means that in this case anyway, capital punishment by the back door isn't going to happen. But that doesn't mean it might not happen to another person. We don't know. But they're not going to change the policy that way. And finally, in December, a bill was proposed in France that would allow for terminal palliative sedation, also known as passive euthanasia. So that is making its way up the line, and it's under consideration in the Assembly in France. So if you want any more information, you can contact me by email at info@tv-ndy.ca. You can go to our website at tvndy.ca. You can go to our Facebook page at facebook.com/toujours vivant, not dead yet, or follow me on Twitter at @TVNDY. You can look at our old videos from September of 2013 to the present on my YouTube channel, which is my name, Amy Hasbrook. You can see it right there, HASBROUCK, or you can just do a search on YouTube for euthanasia and disability, and you will find all of the videos of our online discussions. Thank you very much for joining us, and hopefully I will see you next time. Take care. Goodbye.